Simon Hill, why did you object to this proposal, which seemed eminently reasonable, to just bring more attention, if you like, to Remembrance Day, which actually acknowledges from the First World War all British soldiers who've lost their lives since that day in conflict?
Well, I strongly believe in remembrance. We need to remember those who've died and we need to learn from the past. However, the motion that Tima and his colleagues proposed at Cambridge, and that is sometimes echoed by the Royal British Legion and others, suggests we should only remember British military dead. And I want to remember British military dead. But I also...
we're in Britain. I mean, why would we...
Well, I want to remember British civilians as well, for example. 60,000 British civilians died in World War II.
We can do that as well.
Remembrance Day is about acknowledging the sacrifice made by British servicemen and women. I mean, that's what it is.
Well, war affects everybody. And, for example, my great-granddad fought at the Somme. He fought in the British Army. If he'd been born in Berlin instead of Birmingham, he'd have been fighting in the German army, the Somme.
But it's up to the Germans to remember their dead, surely.
But why can we not all recognise that suffering
Because we're recognising national sacrifice.
But it isn't about sacrifice. When we look at World War I, when we look at millions of people slaughtered in unimaginable
What else do you call it?
I call it a waste of human life.
And the Second World War would be a waste to you?
But we can talk about this or that war, but
I'm asking about the Second World War, which is the last major world war in the world. What was your position about the Second World War, where Adolf Hitler and the Nazis wanted to invade this country and turn us into a fascist state? Were we right to defend ourselves or not?
It was right to oppose fascism, and of course...
How do you do that without going to war?
I recognise that many people were motivated by...
So was that war justified?
I think there was a lot more to it than fighting fascism, but I think that's...
Well, how else do you defeat fascism if you don't fight it?
The point here...
If they're armed to the teeth and they're coming to invade and they start invading Europe, how do you defeat them without using military force?
Both people who do or don't support World War I or II or any other can agree on the need for remembrance.
No, I'm asking you a specific question about World War II.
Yeah, but that isn't what we're talking about.
I don't care. What is your answer to that question? Was it justified or not?
Throughout the 1930s, the British government...
Was World War II justified, yes or no?
It was a whole load of a whole series of conflicts.
Was it justified?
As a collection of
Was Britain's decision to go to war against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, to stop them invading this country and taking us over and turning us into fascists, was that justified or not?
I'm not...
Why can't you say yes or no?
He just can't, because basically... the reason we can actually have this debate today is because of the sacrifices our British veterans have given to our country. The reason we have this debate
is because people, for centuries, from the grassroots, have campaigned for free speech and campaigned for democracy. And some of them, who I respect, have at times believed that it's necessary to use violence to do that.
Can you imagine if we hadn't gone to war during the Second World War, what the consequences would have been?
Well, if Britain hadn't been selling arms to fascist regimes throughout the 1930s, the consequences would have been very different.
So you don't think it was justified for Britain to go to war against Adolf Hitler and the Nazis? What is your position? Just tell me.
We would have become part of a Nazi Europe.
You either think it was a justified war or not. It's one or the other.
No, because it's a whole collection of different conflicts.
Well, what is...
So people resisting Nazi occupation...
OK, you don't want to answer. OK, so let's move to another question. You say you want to remember all soldiers who lose their lives in conflict. Would that extend, for argument's sake, to ISIS soldiers?
I think that's a red herring. I want to remember...
Well, I'm asking you... You keep saying these are red herrings. It's actually fundamental.
You're going off the point.
You said your objection to this motion is that it doesn't extend to people on all sides of conflict. So my question for you is simple, right? Does your belief extend to ISIS soldiers in the battlefield? Would you say they should also be remembered on Remembrance Day? Yes or no?
I don't want to honour them. No, I don't want to.
So you wouldn't include ISIS soldiers?
I want to remember the realities of war and the realities of war.
Does that include ISIS soldiers?
Well, I'm not wanting to honour ISIS soldiers. I mean, we need to know.
But Remembrance Day is about honouring the dead.
You want to acknowledge them.
We need to know who's died, but I want to honour people who died.
Would you include ISIS soldiers?
I don't want to honour ISIS soldiers, no.
Right, so you've eliminated them. Who else would you include? Nazis?
Look, I think you're going off...
No, what I'm fundamentally doing, actually,
90%
is I'm picking holes in your logic, right? You object to this motion because somehow you think it glorifies war and you want to remember everyone who dies. But you don't want to remember ISIS soldiers, so you do have limits, right? But you do want to remember Nazis? Is that your position?
I don't want to honour Nazis or...
So they're out too. Who else? Who's included then?
The 60,000 British civilians who died in World War II.
We can remember British civilians. There are many ways of remembering British civilians who died in the war.
Unfortunately, there is. The British Legion maintain that civilians should not be remembered on Remembrance Day. The British Legion maintain it's only for soldiers.
You don't want to really answer anything.
But people personally can remember the civilians.
That's hardly the same.
Your intention was not to glorify war, right? What was it?
Two members of my committee simply proposed the motion at CUSU, which is the Students' Union at Cambridge, just for them to promote the commemorations of the Poppy Appeal in Remembrance Day.
You want more students to
wear the poppy,
honour the dead, to wear the poppy, and to turn up at Remembrance Day.
Exactly. There was more to the motion than that.
Well, let him talk, please.
Yeah, but Timur, can I just ask, some of these students who voted your motion down have received death threats.
No, of course, and that's something.
What do you mean,
which,
of course?
No, well, that's something that we completely condemn. Exactly. I mean, this is
ridiculous. It shouldn't be happening.
It's provoked a media furore. We're completely against individuals, student individuals.
And also,
targeted.
they feel like they've been misrepresented because they haven't banned Remembrance Day or the wearing of the poppy. This was simply about...
They rejected the motion of the Students' Union actually promoting the wearing of poppies. So a lot can be construed from that. And, I mean, what Simon's just said typifies what the Students' Union said in the debate, which is a profoundly anti-British sentiment.
It's not anti-British.
Let me finish.
Simon's point is to remember civilians.
Civilians,
yeah. But actually, Simon's point, unless I'm wrong here, you had a wider point before you sat down at this desk, right, which is we must recognise the suffering even of ISIS supporters. We can't pick and choose which victims we will support because that leads down a slippery slope.
I don't think I've said
You didn't say any of that?
Not that I recall.
You've never said those words?
I'd be very surprised if I'd...
You've never said we need to recognise the suffering even of ISIS supporters? You've never said that?
Recognise the suffering isn't the same as saying we should support...
So you're more concerned about recognising the suffering of ISIS supporters than you are about endorsing a motion which reminds British students of a sacrifice made by British soldiers in warfare. I mean, I find that absolutely extraordinary.
Look...
I don't care about the suffering of ISIS soldiers. I do care that young people understand the history of this country and understand that in 1945, for example, we celebrated the end of a massively difficult and problematic war which cost millions of lives. But if we hadn't fought it, we now would be speaking German and marching around goose-stepping.
I'm sorry. What I must say is that Remembrance Day is not about the politics behind wars. Soldiers don't have any say in where they're stationed. They don't have any say in the internal politics.
Except on those noble occasions when they've refused to fight.
And you think all soldiers should refuse to fight?
I applaud soldiers who refuse to fight.
Well, we wouldn't have a terribly effective army, would we?
Nobody would have any armies if people...
Well,
so naive.
What would we do about the Nazis and ISIS?
My brother is currently serving his country abroad, right? He's a British Army colonel. So I have a vested interest in your position on this, right? I would just like to know how... if another Adolf Hitler came along tomorrow and built up a military arsenal and firepower like he had with his Nazis, and they threatened...
So we'll get into lots of hypothetical questions.
Actually, it's a hypothetical based on something that actually happened just a few decades ago, right? And this began to invade countries in Europe. And
it might be ISIS.
And they threatened to invade this country, right? How would you stop them if it wasn't military? How would you do it?
To begin with, I'd be calling on the British government not to sell them weapons, as they did to Mussolini.
You've said that. How would you stop them once they're actually invading countries and killing people and exterminating Jews and threatening to turn into a fascist world? How would you do it?
You invited me on to talk about Remembrance Day.
How would you stop them?
Remembrance Day is about remembering the suffering of war so we can learn from the past.
You want to remember the suffering of ISIS soldiers.
I want to remember the suffering of thousands of civilians.
I think your priorities are completely warped.
Yeah, you're saying a lot to me and not letting me answer, Piers.
Because you're denying stuff you've said.
Well, we won't go into whether you've done that as well. But the point is...
I'm not denying stuff I've said.
Well, you're not letting me say much at all.
You're not telling me how you defeat an organisation like the Nazis without using military firepower. How do you do it?
There are lots of soldiers and ex-soldiers who support remembrance for all nationalities. There are lots of soldiers in the Peace Pledge Union.
You find me a British Army soldier who's concerned about the suffering of ISIS terrorists.
There are
you find me one.
OK, I'll email it you later.
Really?
OK.
You think the British soldiers are queuing up to talk about the suffering of poor little ISIS
Look,
terrorists.
We're not talking
Do
about
me a
ISIS
favour.
supporters. We're talking about millions of innocent civilians.
Yeah,
the
sometimes
victims
you have
of
to
ISIS.
stand up for what you believe in, which
Like
was
I'm doing
freedom
now,
and
Piers.
democracy against a tyrannical regime like the Nazis.